Hi there. In today's video, I wanted to talk a little bit about Dolby Atmos. Now, Atmos is quite a hot topic in the world of music right now. So Atmos was something that Dolby originally developed for cinema audio. Traditionally, when mixing for film, I'm not really sure what the most common format for cinema audio is these days, but whatever format that might be, you'd do a mix in that format, and then you'd also have to do a 7.1 mix, a 5.1 mix, and also a stereo mix. So you'd have to mix basically for every format. With Atmos, you don't have to do that anymore. All you have to do is one mix, and then Atmos will scale down to everything below that, right down to stereo. Now, Atmos also, when it comes to stereo, can employ spatial audio tech. The idea is that it recreates the sense of surround sound even when you're listening to music on headphones or in a stereo format. Now, Dolby is really trying to push this forward as almost a replacement for stereo when it comes to recorded music. And so far, we are sort of seeing in the pro audio world people who sit in two camps. So you've got one camp who is very skeptical and is just not convinced it's something that's going to catch on as the new format for recorded music. And then there's the other camp who is all for it. They're like, yeah, Atmos is the new thing. They're investing in Atmos rigs for their studios. They're going full steam ahead on the Atmos train. Now, I'm probably more somewhere in the camp of skeptics. I think for me, there are just quite a few concerns I have as to whether Atmos is really viable as a format for recorded music. I think it makes total sense for film, because for film, surround sound has been the prevailing format for decades now, and surround certainly makes total sense for film. Of course, when you watch a movie at home, you're most likely watching it with stereo audio, but when it comes to the cinema, you go to the cinema, it's always going to be in surround sound. So there is always inherently going to be a need for surround sound when it comes to audio in film. But when it comes to music, I'm sure if you go into a studio or a place with a full proper Atmos rig, it's going to be an incredible listening experience. But I feel like really that's what it is. You know, I think the reason why surround sound works when it comes to film is that when you go to the cinema, you are going to watch a film and you're just doing that and you're soaking in the whole experience. These days, it's often the case when most people are listening to music, they're listening to it whilst they're going about their day, doing other things, whether it's commuting to work or just doing chores around the house, whatever it might be. Really, these days, primarily, your average consumer is either listening on headphones, on their phone, or through their phone speaker, maybe their laptop speakers, but I know a lot of people now who don't even actually own a home stereo. Most people are really just listening to music in headphones or through their phone speaker. And I do this myself. Primarily when I'm outside the studio, I listen to music on my phone from Spotify. On headphones, I'm primarily on headphones. I like listening to music with sort of the full range spectrum, but I do also just, when I'm at home, like when I'm getting ready in the morning, I'll just stick on some music on my phone speaker. And I think a lot of people are doing this these days. So I guess I say this because I'm not really convinced that there is an actual market when it comes to the end consumer for spatial audio and a surround format. I think, like I say, if you were going into an actual environment with a full Atmos rig and you were just sitting down just to soak in that whole experience, I'm sure most people would love it and they'd find it a very satisfying, emotive experience. But day to day, most people are just not consuming music in this way. They're listening to music whilst they're doing other things, or, they're just, I don't think really are going to want that intense a listening experience primarily. I think this is why stereo has prevailed as the winning format for music. It was an obvious step up from mono, because jumping from one speaker to two speakers, you suddenly had a lot of options for creating a sense of greater depth and width in music, but it was still a format that was largely convenient. You only had to get one more speaker. So if you're listening on a stereo system, you only need 2 speakers. Headphones, you just need a pair of headphones. So it's a convenient format. It's a nice balance between the sensation of sound enveloping you more, but also in a way that's convenient and is not too overwhelming. So far, I know Apple are on board with Atmos. So with Apple Music, Atmos is something that's on their streaming services. Spotify have not quite yet jumped on board, but I'm sure they will, or they might jump on board with a different Atmos-like format. I have heard rumblings. I think there are other companies out there that are developing their competitor to the Atmos format, but the idea being that we're going to see more of these spatial audio formats. Now, this is something that's been tried in the past in a different way. So we've had different surround formats in the past. We've had quad, and we've also had 5.1 mixes when it comes to music, and 7.1 as well. But it's never really something that's caught on and become something that's mainstream. It's become more of a kind of niche thing. So there are still bands out there today not releasing music in quad. Quad's something that's kind of died, but in 5.1 and 7.1, there are still some artists that are releasing music in this format. But it's always sort of an additional extra to stereo. They're still releasing their music in stereo, and people are still primarily consuming it this way. It's only really for, say, your audiophiles and your real fanatics of a particular band or artist, where they'll go out and they'll get these surround mixes as well, and they'll have a dedicated surround sound set up at home. Now, I do have a 5.1 system in my living room set up for watching films, and I love that experience. But again, I'm just sitting down primarily to do that. I don't think I would really be that interested in consuming Atmos music day to day, and I don't think your average person is either. I don't think most people are really going to care enough to notice the difference. I think what we're going to see with Apple Music and other streaming services is that when an artist has their music mixed in Atmos, you play back that song and it's going to default to the Atmos mix. And if you're listening on something that's Atmos enabled, it's going to play back in that spatial format. I don't think most people are going to even realize that it's Atmos or care. For me, the main issue here is that it's got to be something that there's got to be more money in it, basically. Like with any product, there has to be the ability to profit from it. If there's no profit in it, then it's not going to succeed naturally. So if you look at it this way, an artist records their song and they get it mixed in stereo. And they also pay extra for an Atmos mix. They've spent this extra money on an Atmos mix, and then they go and release it on streaming services and even on CD, whatever formats they might be releasing this music on. When it comes to streaming services specifically, Spotify, Apple Music, Tidal, all the other services, they're not paying extra money for an artist's stream when it's streamed in the Atmos mix. Maybe that's something that will happen, but I think in order for there to be an incentive for streaming services to pay out more for Atmos streams, it's going to have to entice people to listen to that artist's music more. I just can't really see that happening. I don't think Atmos as a format is going to make people consume more music on streaming services. I don't think it's going to make them go out and buy more physical releases. All I've really heard when it comes to Atmos so far is that everything's in relation to streaming services. I don't really know how it is going to work, or if it even could work when it comes to physical formats like vinyl and CD. And of course, vinyl, there's a very popular market for that right now. CD, you could argue, is maybe on the way out, but a lot of people are very into their vinyl these days. So it's got to be something that you could get people to widely adopt. And I just don't think most people are going to. Most people I talk to, they're not even aware of Atmos. They've never heard of it. They don't know what it is. I'll explain it to them and they don't really care. I don't think most people they're not interested. The technology also has to be accessible as well. I think it's a weird one, because I think the way that Dolby and, participating third parties, streaming services and so on are trying to push it is that it's just going to be something that will just happen with, Atmos enabled devices and services. And when it's Atmos enabled, music is just going to play back in Atmos. Of course, if it's been mixed in Atmos, it'd be something you would turn off rather than you would turn on, which, in that sense, you're just sort of shoving it down people's throats, and they're not going to be aware that they're actually necessarily consuming music in a different way. So is it actually going to provide people a reason to consume more music? I know as well that when it comes to Atmos-enabled devices, the effectiveness is going to kind of vary from device to device. I think headphones is going to be the most consistent experience when it comes to spatial audio. But I know there's also soundbars, Atmos-enabled soundbars, where they're doing trickery with basically reflections. So it's firing out sound, it's dispersing in a certain way where sound is reflecting off your ceiling, and then it uses those reflections to create the sensation of height speakers, and then I guess the same for rears. And it's using dispersion basically to throw and scatter sound around in a certain way where it sort of simulates the sensation of having surround speakers around you in a space. But I can't really see how this will work effectively when there's no level of consistency, because it's very dependent on the environment you're in. So how big is your room? How high or low are your ceilings? And the experience and the effectiveness of that soundbar technology is going to vary a lot depending on the space that you're in. People just want something that's convenient. As long as things sound decent enough, they're not too concerned. I'm talking about your average consumer here. They're just not too concerned with fidelity, and they don't want to spend time faffing around, placing their soundbar in the right place to get the best Atmos experience. Most people, they're just going to plug it in and just accept whatever listening experience it gives them. If because of that it gives people an inferior listening experience, I think people they won't necessarily realize, especially if they're not aware of what Atmos actually is, they won't necessarily realize that something different is happening, but they'll just know that something is different and something's off. And if anything, it could go the other way. It could have a detrimental effect and put people off listening to music more. They might just go, oh, this song sounds bad. It's a really interesting time right now. I'm not sure where things are going to go with Atmos. I know as well the feasibility, this is the other thing, for studios to install an Atmos configuration. For me, for example, I'm in a tiny control room. I've got a very small studio. There's no way, even if I had the capital to invest in an Atmos rig, there's no way I could make it effectively work in a room this small. It's just not going to happen. My ceiling is probably high enough, but the room is just, there's not enough depth. I couldn't possibly really have enough space to even install enough speakers, and there wouldn't be enough of a sizable room for it to work effectively. I'm pretty sure anyway. I couldn't see it working well, and this is going to be the case for many studios, even with studios with bigger control rooms than mine. It's still not something that's going to be viable. And of course, there is the cost. I've seen various people put together Atmos rigs for relatively cheap. So, on the top end, you could be talking tens of thousands or 100,000. Like you could be talking a lot of money. But there are also people who have done it for relatively cheap. My Kali Innates that I have here in the studio, for a pair, I think they run about £800. So if you put together an Atmos rig just with Kali Innates, you could do that relatively affordably. But there's also a huge learning curve with Atmos. It's not something that I've dived into yet. That's the whole thing you have to learn. And it's not just as simple with setting up an Atmos rig as just throwing up some speakers. You've got to configure it right. There's a lot to calculate. There's a lot of math involved. It's far more complex naturally than just setting up a stereo monitoring system. And setting up an effective stereo monitoring system is often difficult enough in a studio anyway to get an accurate listening environment. An Atmos room, I'm sure, is going to require like a lot more acoustic treatment and isolation. You know, you'd have to really rethink your entire control room setup. You've got to learn the whole Atmos format. You've got to get good at mixing in Atmos. And I think this is the problem we're seeing at the moment from what I've heard about a lot of Atmos mixes, is with the quality varying a lot. Some Atmos mixes are just not that good because people don't really know how to mix in Atmos very well just yet. And so in time, I'm sure that will improve. And there are also a lot of people, from what I've heard, trying to, in headphones, like in AirPods or whatever, trying to deliver Atmos mixes that way when they can't set up a proper Atmos speaker rig. And they're doing their mixes in stereo, but then trying to sort of almost convert it to Atmos. People are trying to do that with their stereo mixes, then just go like, oh, I'll throw the guitar over there, I'll spread the drums out, and it's resulting in not very good Atmos mixes because really you've got to do Atmos from the ground up. And as someone running a small independent project studio, I'm really working with independent artists and artists local to me, and I know absolutely none of those are asking me for Atmos mixes. Again, most artists I speak to are not even aware of what Atmos is. And if they are, you know, it's not something that's on their mind. They're not like, oh, I need to put my music out in Atmos. So nobody's asking me for it. So there's no incentive there for me to spend money on an Atmos rig, even if I could, and learn Atmos and learn how to mix in Atmos. Even if there was that incentive, there were people asking me, then of course I'd have to spend all that time, invest all that money, and then I would have to make that viable by charging a certain amount for Atmos mixes, which then, in order for artists to actually want to pay me that money for doing mixes in Atmos, there's got to be viability there for them to actually make more money from having their music in Atmos. So it's a lot to think about. Let me know in the comments what your thoughts are on Atmos. Is it something that you are jumping on the bandwagon with, or are you totally against it? Or do you sit somewhere in the middle? I'd love to hear your thoughts on the subject, and I'd love to know, for those of you out there who have actually invested in an Atmos setup, whether it's in your studio for mixing or whether it's just for listening. I'd love to know what your experience has been with it so far, and you know, how do you feel about it, and do you feel it was worth the investment, and is it something that you see being the primary sort of way that you would consume music moving forward, or do you see it more as something where you're going to mostly listen to music in stereo, but when you want, you know, a really kind of enjoyable listening experience and you just want to sit down, close the doors and just listen to music, you'd listen to Atmos then? Let me know your thoughts. Drop a like on the video if you enjoyed what I had to say. Subscribe to the channel, of course, if you're new here, and I'll see you again in the next one.